Hello, and welcome to the Resource Governor module of the Microsoft Certified Master SQL Server online training. This training is not supposed to be a substitute for the broad experience and deep knowledge you'll need for this certification, but it will give you an idea of the breadth of material you're supposed to know and the depth to which you should know it. By way of a very quick introduction, my name is Paul Randall and I've been an instructor of the MCM SQL certification since its inception as the Microsoft Internal Ranger program. I'm an expert in many aspects of SQL Server internals and usage. I spent 9 years on the SQL Server storage engine team, and now I spend my time teaching, consulting, and writing about SQL Server. You can read the rest of this intro slide for yourself. So what I'm going to do in this short module is I'm going to give you a quick overview of what Resource Governor is. We're going to walk through some of the concepts, some of the new nomenclature that's been defined to describe Resource Governor. We're going to look at some limitations of Resource Governor, basically what you can, what you can't do. So in terms of why Resource Governor is there, as it says there on the slide, there's long been a need for an easy way to implement quotas essentially inside SQL Server. A way of being able to say that this person or this workload or this group of people can have this set of resources, this other group of people can have this set of resources. When there's contention for resources, this group wins out over this group's throttled to this much, and so on and so on. And to be able to have that change dynamically over time. One of the things that has been a problem for SQL DBAs for quite a while is the ability of somebody to log into SQL Server and essentially take over the whole box by running a query that can take all the resources available to SQL Server. So something called like a runaway query. So it'd be really good for you to be able to define a way of essentially sandboxing people such that they can't use all the resources for SQL Server. The another good thing to be able to do is to be able to say, I've got this particularly critical workload. I want to make sure that this particular server, this workload on this server has a defined set of resources. And if anything else untoward happens on that server, my critical workload is always going to have the resources that it needs. These are the kind of things you can do with Resource Governor, because Resource Governor allows you to, whenever a new connection comes into the server, essentially do what's called classify that connection, and the connection gets dropped into essentially a bucket. And then for the lifetime of that particular connection, the connection runs within the resource limits that are assigned to that particular bucket. Now we're going to talk about all the different words and what they mean. The buckets are what are called workload groups. The resources that are assigned to that particular workload group are called a resource pool. You can have multiple workload groups using resource pools. You can do all kinds of monitoring with perfmon. The demo that I hope you watch after this shows you some of the monitoring you can do. You can do all kinds of things like prioritizing different workload groups. It's quite a rich set of controls that you can make use of to create your Resource Governor configuration. The other cool thing you can do is you can make changes to your Resource Governor configuration while the Resource Governor is actually running, while your workload is running. There are some limitations to that I'm going to go through, but basically you can change the limits essentially that are set on resource pools. You can change some of the limits that are set on workload groups. You can then reconfigure your Resource Governor. It picks up the new changes you've made, and gradually it will start to take an effect on the system. So looking at the various new concepts, the first one is what I call workload groups. This is the thing I call buckets, I should say. Now, a workload group, again, just an invented term, it's the thing that your connection gets assigned to when the connection has been classified. So you could create a workload group for a particular group of users. In the demo that I do, I have a workload group for a marketing group. I have another workload group for a development group. But you could have, say, an executive group. You could have a group that supports running background reports. You could have one that supports running background batch processes or maintenance tasks. So the nice thing about Resource Governor is that it's all controlled using DDL statements. So back in the 2005 timeframe, the SQL team made a promise that all new features would have nice DDL rather than stored procedures or functions controlling them. Many of the new features have this, and Resource Governor is one of the ones that is controlled through DDL. So just as it says there on the slide, all the regular create, alter, drop you can do for a workload group. Now, a workload group has to be assigned to a particular resource pool, because the resource pool is the thing that has the CPU and memory limits assigned to it. Now, as we're going to see in the demo, there's there are two groups that are always defined and you can't change them. The first one's called the internal group, and there's another one called the default group. The internal group is where background processes reside, things like Checkpoint and Ghost Cleanup, which are kind of always running as background tasks. They pop up every so often, they do some work. They have to be able to get the resources that they need. So the internal group will actually pressurize everything else. It's kind of the most important workload group that there is. The default group is the least important group. It's there as a catch-all in case your classification function doesn't specify a workload group name for a particular connection after the connection has been classified. In that case, the connection gets dropped into the default group. The default group has no limits, but it gets pressurized by everything else. So when you're creating your classification function, you want to make sure that the classification function does result in a specific workload group name being output for every connection that can come in. So a bunch of testing, obviously. So a bunch of different things that you can set for workload groups. I'm not going to run through them all. You can read this slide just as well as I can. There's an interesting one though, the group max requests. You'll see me play with that in the demo. This is the maximum number of concurrent connections that can be classified in that particular group. So it's set by default to 0, which means unlimited. Now if you set that to say 2, that says that there can only be 2 connections to the server that classify into that particular workload group. If you try to create another connection to the server, it will essentially hang until there is a spare connection, if you will, to allow that particular connection to be classified into that particular group. Classification I've mentioned a few times now. So you have to define what's called a classifier function. It's a T-SQL function, and it has to essentially spit out the name of one of your defined workload groups. And these workload groups have what's called sysnames. That's a predefined type. Now, you can't change the nature of this function. It has to be T-SQL, it has to spit out a sysname. But inside that function, you can do absolutely anything you like. So it can be as complicated or as simple as you like. In the demo that I'm going to do, I just used the database name that was specified on the connection string. But you could get into usernames, you could get into group names, you could get into various connection properties, get into the time of day, for instance. So as it says there, you could have, say for instance, from 9 AM to 5 PM, you have it set up so that the classifier function is done by username or group name. And then from 5 PM round to 9 AM in the morning, the kind of batch processes and maintenance tasks get the lion's share of the connections, of the resources. So again, you can be as complicated as you want. Now, you can't create a CLR classifier function, but you can call a CLR function from within the T-SQL one that you have to create. Now, bottom point there, be careful. If you make your classifier function too complicated and you have a low query timeout limit set, then you run the risk of the query timeout limit being hit before the classifier function has finished running. This is the same problem that you can run into with overly complicated logon triggers as well. So resource pools. The resource pool is the thing that defines the amount of CPU and memory that can be used. Now, the amount of memory is not what you might think. It's the amount of query execution memory that's given to that particular connection. It is not the total amount of server memory that everything to do with this particular connection is using. In other words, it doesn't take into account the buffer pool, doesn't take into account things like the plan cache. Okay? So you could have a connection that is using a very small amount of query execution memory but causes an enormous amount of data to be read into the server, thus using up a lot of buffer pool memory. That is not, you can't do anything about that in this version of the Resource Governor. Hopefully in a future version we'll see that in there. Now, just like there's a default and internal workload group, there's also a default and internal resource pool that are mapped to those default and internal workload groups. Now, the amount of CPU that you set is the amount of CPU that's being used on a particular scheduler. So if you have a multi-CPU machine, then the amount of throttling that you might see based on CPU may not be completely intuitive, because you may have a connection from one resource pool go onto one scheduler and a connection from another resource pool go onto another scheduler, and there might not be any throttling done. Okay? So the the throttling that's done is not based on the amount of CPU that's being used across all schedulers inside SQL Server. So again, you might see some strange effects. So make sure you play around with the resource governor on a test system before you put it into production. So throttling may not happen because of that reason. It also may not happen because the limits may not yet have been reached. Just because a workload is set to be throttled when there is contention, if there's no contention for the resources, that workload will be allowed to use as much of the CPU as it wants. So a very important point is that the resource governor only kicks in and actually does some governing when it's really necessary. Apart from that, everything can use whatever resources it wants. So just kind of grouping all the concepts together, you have a bunch of different workload groups and resource pools that you've defined. Okay? You've set the various limits. When a connection is made to SQL Server, the classifier function is run. The classifier function spits out the name of a workload group. The connection is put into the bucket, essentially, that is that workload group, and then that connection runs within the limits of what's been set for the workload group and for the resource pool that the workload group has been assigned to. And it's set to do that until that connection is done. Now, what this means is if you have a runaway query that's already running on SQL Server, you can't suddenly set up resource governor, set it running, and have it throttle that connection that's already a runaway query. Okay? It's only new connections that come in that are going to adhere to the resource governor settings. Similarly, if you have misconfigured your resource governor, you may not be able to make the configuration changes that you want to be able to handle a runaway query until that particular connection has dropped out of the resource pool that you want to change. In terms of limitation, so it's a very cool feature, but it can't do absolutely everything. It only works for a single instance of the SQL Server database engine. If you have multiple instances on a single server, the resource governors for the various SQL Server instances do not talk to each other. You would have to use WSRM to be able to divide up the amount of CPU for each of the executables that are running and memory, and then inside each SQL Server use resource governor to divvy up the resources based on connections. Now, the controls that there are for version 1 of Resource Governor, because this is version 1, is CPU usage and query execution memory grants. There's no way to throttle the amount of I/O that's being done. I really hope to see that in the next version, because that would allow you to do not just essentially the amount of memory that's being used for query execution. You could also have some control over the amount of memory that's being used for the buffer pool and the amount of I/O contention that's being generated by a particular query. Because again, you could have a query that's hardly using any CPU, hardly using any memory, but is driving an enormous amount of I/O. For instance, maybe a parallel scan of a very large clustered index, because there's no supporting non-clustered indexes for the queries that you'd want to use. Now, there's also, unfortunately, no way to tell that a particular connection to the server was throttled in some way. Okay? Again, I hope that comes in version 2. That would be very useful to be able to tell what's being throttled and how it's being throttled. I mentioned earlier on that you can dynamically change some of the settings that there are for resource groups, for resource pools, for workload groups. The demo is going to show you a couple of changes being made and actually watching the effect of those changes, how they can gradually occur sometimes. And some changes gradually occur, some changes can occur straight away. Now, for instance, if you change the number of concurrent requests that there can be for a particular workload group, and you already have more than that number of connections for that workload group, it doesn't suddenly kill some of those connections. That setting won't really take effect until you try to add another connection, and you'll see that that won't be allowed. And again, the demo shows you that. In terms of monitoring, there's a bunch of DMVs that you can look at. There's performance counters. I don't go through all the performance counters in the demo. You can look these up in Books Online and have a look yourself. Again, there's Books Online for Resource Governor is pretty comprehensive. There's also a very good white paper, and the link to that, I'll show you where to find that at the end of this module. In terms of tool support, the feature is one of the few that has full tool support in SSMS. So you can do anything you can do with T-SQL for Resource Governor you can actually do through SSMS as well. So there's just a quick screen capture of that, and a screen capture of the Resource Governor properties for a bunch of different pools. So I mentioned the demo a few times now. Go and have a look at the demo, because that shows you setting up Resource Governor. It shows a very simple scenario that shows throttling actually occurring, and then it plays with some of the CPU settings and shows the effect of that happening in Perfmon. So if you kind of hung up on all the new nomenclature that there is, go look at the demo, because it explains in kind of more detail and actually shows you what's going on. So just to review, we looked at what the Resource Governor is, why it's been needed for quite a while in SQL Server, the capabilities of it. We talked about the various concepts, this new nomenclature that's been invented, and I walked through some of the limitations that there are in terms of what Resource Governor can do and what it can't do. Specifically things like it can't do I/O throttling, and you can't have multiple instances of SQL Server kind of collaborating to govern resources. There's a lot more information that can help you with studying for your MCM certification out on the sqlskills.com/mcm.asp page, specifically for this module and all the recordings that there are out there. Thanks for listening.